why not have an event of unabashedly progressive left politics to be held on this campus in Orange County, of all places, and to invite none other than our guest, David Barsamian, whom I'll introduce in a few moments. We've dubbed this event as Oppositional Intellectuals in Times of Crises. And some of the names we've put in there, what do these people have in common? Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn, Edward Said, Arundhati Roy, and what is in common is that they speak truth to power. Let me just introduce some things about the intellectual oppositional stance. Let me suggest that we live in an age of rising right-wing nationalisms and xenophobia, not only here, but in India as well, for example, with Prime Minister Modi, right? And of ongoing US-supported wars and destruction in the Middle East, whether it is in Syria or Yemen, and perpetual denial of Palestinian rights. This is precisely why my work on Said, which will be finished in 1 year, as my publisher has instructed me, deals with Said as an oppositional intellectual. What alternatives would someone like Edward Said provide? What would his democratic humanism suggest as an alternative to the current state of affairs? How might he view the paralysis of Palestinian movement? His insistence on secular democratic criticism, is it relevant to our modern age? Writing in 1927, Julien Benda in La Trahison des Clercs, The Treason of the Intellectuals. He was a fairly conservative scholar that Said often refers to, very much as Swift and others who were conservative, but Said liked those because he studied comparative literature. Julien Benda notes in 1927 words that clearly apply to our present circumstances. Our age is indeed the age of the intellectual organization of political hatreds. It will be one of its chief claims in the moral history of humanity. These prescient words are terrifying, and they are precisely the call to arms that oppositional intellectuals take, and we need their voices, the people like Said, Chomsky, Zinn, Arundhati Roy, Tariq Ali, and the list goes on and on. Said wrote from the comforts of an elite university in New York, connecting his theoretical or contrapuntal insights into the political controversies of the day, whether it's Israel, Palestine, the Arab world, the clash of Islams and the clash of the Wests, as it were. He went against the grain, if you will, offering a counter-narrative on these thorny issues. In addition to critiquing and opposing imperialism, Said actively supported liberation movements. His mentor on liberation movements is Iqbal Ahmad, and he's not as well known, but this is a work that in one of the books that David Barsamian has done that I think you might want, and I think there's a new edition coming out of this work because Southern Press no longer is in Iqbal Ahmad Confronting Empire. Said critiqued these movements, and he critiqued what he called native informants, people like Fuad Ajami, the Lebanese who became the best, the most beloved Arab who hated Arabs, and Kan'an Makiya, the Iraqi who promised us that the American troops will be greeted with flowers entering Baghdad in 2003. And the embedded intellectuals, by embedded I mean those embedded within the realm of, say, the military, if you will, like Bernard Lewis and Sam Huntington, and somebody on the left, a personal friend of mine, before he joined his neocon phase, Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens. All of these types served as the equivalent of Machiavelli's advisors to the prince. They served power and the state in the same way that H.R. McMaster displayed in his presence at Chapman. Said opposed power and state to quell resistance and oppression. Said's conception of the intellectual both expands and is consistent with Antonio Gramsci's agenda for the organic intellectual. He or she must uphold moral broad interests, especially in the defense of the deprived and the oppressed of society. Said insists that the intellectual, this is in his work on representation of the intellectual must never shy away from criticism because of loyalty to nation. We will broach the question of nationalism in the course of our discussion and probably bringing it up in the context of some of Iqbal Ahmad's observations. Thus, the native intellectual must resist the temptation, as Said puts it, to narcotize the critical sense or reduce its imperatives, which always go beyond survival questions and political liberation, to critiques of the leadership, to presenting alternatives that are often marginalized or pushed aside as irrelevant to the main battle at hand. In effect, Said's critical realization of Gramsci's model of the intellectual, fused with Dubois' social double consciousness and Arendt's conscious pariah. He belonged critically and remained outside and apart from what was his own. To paraphrase Isaac Deutscher, he is the non-national national. And this is canonically, we who study political science, the position of the prophet and the moral legislator in political theory and political theology. Indeed, when Chomsky, Howard Zinn, what do Chomsky, Howard Zinn, Arundhati Roy, and Edward Said have in common? The subtitle of our event suggests a simple answer: speaking truth to power. Today, we are enabled to have a conversation about these large concerns. David Barsamian, my colleague, friend, introduced to me by Edward Said, and I met him in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in my office at the time for 3 years. And he had just finished his first interview with Said in 1987. Edward insisted, Edward was my personal friend, so I call him by his first name. Edward insisted that he meet a fellow Armenian like me. And indeed, David is Armenian from New York City, and he moved to Boulder, Colorado in 1978. But both he and I, though not living in New York, still remain rabid Yankee fans. In 1979, David, in his first year in Boulder, Colorado, established a radio program, Ganges to the Nile. In a moment, I will ask him about these beginnings and subsequent transformations. In 1986, I believe he founded Alternative Radio, which is going on in its 33rd full year as an important program. It is an award-winning weekly hour public affairs program offered free to the public. It plays all over the country in about 260 stations and overseas as well. It provides information and analyses that are frequently ignored or distorted in corporate media. His program, AR, airs on a vast number of stations. I think he's one of America's most tireless and wide-ranging investigative journalists. He's an operation of one, right? In many ways, you are of the 80s representing what I.F. Stone was in the 50s and 60s. Some of us are old enough to remember I.F. Stone's Weekly. Peter, I'm sure you and I would remember that. And you should know who I.F. Stone is. He's one of the incredible American writers. The word maverick belongs to him, not to the late John McCain. Now, through this project, he has produced an incredible amount of programs and books with Iqbal Ahmad, as this one, with Edward Said, Howard Zinn, Tariq Ali, Richard Wolff, Arundhati Roy, and Noam Chomsky. The latest of Chomsky's book is this one here that will be available for sale at the end of the program. David Barsamian is the winner of the Media Education Award, the ACLU's Upton Sinclair Award for Independent Journalism, and the Cultural Freedom Fellowship from the Lannan Foundation, right? So he is an important figure. For me, for those of you who might know, how many of you know the name Studs Terkel? Right? It's only the old folks in the... right? Studs Terkel, to me, Chicago-based radio program and the subsequent books he produced. He produced a compendium of oral histories on the lives of common people. Among them, most importantly, the Good War in 1984, hard times in the Great Depression. He captured something, and I think in international affairs programming and critical programming of this nature, David captures another dimension of what Studs Terkel captured. In my introduction to The Pen and the Sword, which is the second edition, the first edition was introduced by Iqbal Ahmad. Both Saeed and Iqbal had passed away, and I was kind of the only one left to write the introduction, so David invited me or kind of coaxed me into it, whichever, but I did. I wrote partly, David Barsamian, in my intro, displays his expansive knowledge and engagement with Edward Said's work. He engages Said, and might I add, in all the other interviews he's done with these major luminaries, critical oppositional intellectuals, in dialogues that connect and weave together Said's ideas on culture, imperialism, Orientalism, exile, and Palestine. Barsamian's questions display his worldliness, which in turn allows Said to connect his humanism to his political engagements. So please welcome David Barsamian. I will be joined. We are turning the tables around on David. He's not doing the interviewing, we are. My colleague Tom Zoellner from the English department, and as well the political editor of the LA Review will be joining me. I will start with some questions, and I'm going to sit back here now, and then that will take on some.
Are the mics on? Can you hear me?
The mics are on.
Okay.
All right. So what I'd like to, David, the liberal and not so liberal media seems oblivious to history. We're shocked by the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. That's how you pronounce it. Jamal Khashoggi, by one of our strategic allies. Let me ask a question here. Two names, and how many of you will recognize? Probably four of you. Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat. How many of you know those names? Young people, these two people were assassinated in Washington, D.C. by Pinochet's henchmen of Chile, the fascist dictatorship that overthrew Allende. We didn't criticize Pinochet for this. So this is not a first for us. We have a long history, and probably one of the most important chroniclers of these details of history is one of the people that David has interviewed at length, probably the chronicler of Noam Chomsky. Okay. So our allies and we have killed and overthrown those leaders we don't like. Jamal Khashoggi was murdered by the Saudi regime. We know that. The White House still doesn't. Right? They think he died accidentally. The New York Times and others have dubbed him as a principled and dissident player in the Saudi drama. But was he in opposition to the Saudi regime? David, what I'd like you to do is maybe tell us something about what we and our worthy allies have done in this domain. It is kind of a brief history, this in the manner that Chomsky details the history in so many bloody books, right, about the way we have engaged the world in getting rid of our enemies, the Democrats, and upholding the tyrants of the world as our allies.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to Chapman. It's good to see you all here. Good evening. I know I'm getting closer to the end than the beginning as I've been receiving some Lifetime Achievement Awards lately, but that will not deter me from giving you some vigorous and robust perspectives. I began alternative radio, as was mentioned, in 1978, 79, as a kind of tonic to the corporate control propaganda. At that time, there was a wonderful book came out by Ben Bagdikian, who coincidentally happens to be Armenian from Marash, Turkey. And the book was called The Media Monopoly. And he noted for the first time that there was an accelerating trend in the media field of concentration. And he thought this might endanger democracy. This may have real implications for politics and the political economy. At that time, there were 50 corporations that controlled most of the media in the United States. He wrote subsequent additions to the media monopoly, and you can trace the trajectory. The next one was 28 corporations, then 23, then 14, then 10, and before he died, the last one was, I think, 6. That number is down now to 4. And I think media plays such a pivotal role in creating an illiterate population. I'm talking about this earlier today with Ekbal, to the extent of political illiteracy in the United States. A complete lack of knowledge. You know, Gore Vidal used to make the joke, we're the USA, the United States of amnesia. Last week was history. Last month, ancient history. Last year, forget about it, like they say on The Sopranos. You know, just prehistoric. So there's no memory. And what Chomsky points out over and over again is that if you have historical amnesia, then you're laying the groundwork. I'm almost quoting him directly from this book. You're laying the groundwork for future crimes. And that's why you see these repetitive patterns over and over again. The interventions, the invasions, the economic warfare, that's what sanctions are. They should call it economic warfare. It's another form of attacking a country. The subversions that go on, the coups d'etats, the overthrowing of democratically elected governments, the assassination of third world leaders like Patrice Lumumba, very significantly in the Congo in 1960, and a whole host of other people who have been knocked off, you know, by the U.S. directly or surrogates. It was mentioned about Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat in Washington, D.C. When crimes are committed by the empire and the empire's allies, the U.S. has a permanent get-out-of-jail pass. It is not subject to international law. This is, I think, a classic example of how imperialism operates in the real world. In fact, you cannot, in polite company, in discourse of the media, you cannot attach the prefix United States to the noun imperialism. You can talk about French imperialism, British imperialism, the Romans, the Greeks, the Soviets, whatever, but not the United States, because we are above that. We are full of benign intentions. We want to, liberate the world, bring them the joys and bounties of the so-called free market and democracy. So it's in many instances delivering democracy out of the barrel of a gun. And we see in the Middle East in particular, where the U.S. has been intervening vigorously since the end of the Second World War, basically when it took over the world from the British and then the dying French empires, that the U.S. has been masking its intentions, and this is where I think Chomsky, plays a significant role in stripping away the veneer of acceptability and the veneer of benign intentions and wanting to liberate and to help people. This has always been kind of the motif of all imperialisms, to defend what they do on the basis of helping other people. Like, we're really concerned about human rights violations in one part of the world, but in another part of the world, we're not so concerned. So, as my friend Michael Parenti says, we're not making the world safe for democracy, we're making it safe for hypocrisy. And that, I think, is central to understanding U.S. foreign policy. It's not a double standard, it's a quadruple standard. So I travel a lot outside of the U.S. I used to travel to India quite often, but I've been banned from that, the world's largest democracy, since 2011. And incidentally, that's not under Modi, who is an outright racist and Hindu fanatic, but it was under the neoliberal regime of Manmohan Singh, who's a kind of very reasonable, sedate man, and that's still going on, that ban that I can't get back into India. So, we live in very dangerous times right now. I don't want to scare you, and I do want to scare you a little bit, because the dog whistle politics that we're witnessing now has a tremendous, I think, poses a tremendous danger to the country, and by extension to the planet, because our looming crisis is fast approaching. It's already happening. And you know that poem by Martin Niemöller, the famous German dissident who was in Dachau and Sachsenhausen under Hitler because he resisted Hitler? First they came for, right? You know that poem, first they came for the Jews and I wasn't Jewish. Well, I've changed that around for climate change and also for the targeting of minorities. Now I say, first they came for the Pacific Islanders and I didn't do anything. The waters were rising, right? Then they came for the Bangladeshis, it went underwater. I wasn't a Bangladeshi. Then they came for the Sri Lankans, it was washed away. Then they came for Trinidad, it was washed away. No. And now that, they've come for me and there's no one left. Everything's underwater now. So it's a moment of where resistance is, I think, essential, and the role of intellectuals to give not just the critique, which in a way, talking about the current regime is like shooting fish in a barrel. I don't feel any virtue in doing that. The transgressions are so monumental. The level of xenophobia and misogyny and race baiting and all the rest, patriarchal, politics. I feel, intellectuals need to provide alternatives, creative ways of thinking and acting outside the box. And as Gramsci would say, being organic, connecting with movements, to give those movements the kind of intellectual fuel they need to go forward. So just being in an ivory tower, it's not enough. You could be producing great work, but I think it's very important to connect with Black Lives Matter, with 350.org, with Code Pink, or whatever campus organization you have here or in the community, and working on building a movement that will sustain itself. So, I started alternative radio because I was fed up with the corporate media, and I couldn't believe that people like Chomsky were nowhere to be seen or heard in the radio or on TV or in magazines or newspapers. So that's basically why I began this. And just to wind up, because I want to give some encouragement to the younger people in the audience, I didn't have a clue about how to do radio. And so I made monumental mistakes. And when you're doing live radio, there's like no prisoners. It's not like, well, afterwards you can cut out this mistake, but you're on the air live. And so I had a couple of specialities. One was not turning my mic on, and then you could only hear the voice of the person that was being interviewed, or vice versa. That was one thing I used to do. And then people in Boulder used to stop me and they would ask, is this some kind of Zen exercise you're doing where we have to imagine what the questions were?
Maybe it's your India influence, right?
Or, you could only hear my questions and not hear the answers. So I assured them it was just my bumbling technology. And then the other specialty was eliminating master tapes by hitting record instead of play. So, but I overcame those things, okay? It's not astrophysics. It's not, that difficult, and I got better and better at it. So, engaging in some activity like that is, I think, I've managed to somehow parlay it into an actual profession that supports me and another full-timer and a half-timer, and we're crammed into 500 square feet in Boulder, Colorado. I invite you all to come and visit. And here's the latest catalog. Just before I left, I finished a program with Chris Hedges, who's one of our finest independent journalists. It's called Root Causes of a Failed State. And a lot of what we're witnessing right now, again, connects with Gramsci when he was talking about civilizations in decline. When that happens, a lot of morbid symptoms arise. There's a belief in, magical thinking, irrational anti-science, anti-enlightenment thinking come to the fore. Pigs can fly, birds can speak Sanskrit, all kinds of ludicrous types of things. Boulder has a reputation for being also a Nouvelle Age center, so you see posters about talking with angels and how you could do that. I think, and another one I'm reminded of was, the Maitreya has come. This is like a savior, right? And at the top of the poster said, the greatest event in human history, which was a relief to me because, I hate to be associated with one of the greatest events. So the modesty of that, I think, was very impressive. But again, just to complain about the media, it's not enough. It's important to do something about it, and this is what I do. I just finished that Chris Hedges program, then a historical program on Fannie Lou Hamer, a great African-American liberation fighter who led the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964. She was a sharecropper. She fought for voting rights, which is very timely right now as we're getting reports more and more of voter rolls being purged in Georgia, in North Carolina, and in other southern states as well. Did a program with the former Greek Minister of the Economy, How Capitalism Works, Francis Fox Piven, What Movements Do, etc. You can get a catalog here. Excuse me. I don't know if that answered your question. I'm speaking rather quickly.
Yeah, well, first I'd like to ask people, how many of you attended the event yesterday with Dolores Huerta? Right. I'm so happy to see that, because there are voices that are simply not heard. And even within the progressive left, the women always took the back seat, even though they were doing the hard work. And I think, I think Professor Carmichael Peters was telling me that he asked students in his class, how many of you have heard of Cesar Chavez? A lot of them did. When Dolores Huerta's name was brought up, very few knew, right? And you cannot understand that movement. I mean, she was equal to, if not greater in role, I think, than Cesar Chavez, right? So, well, I want to go back a little bit on Chomsky for a couple of minutes. Now, I remember in 1986, I was speaking at an event with Chomsky. Chomsky is a man I respect highly, and he's also a good friend. And then the next day I was flying to Paris and then on to Beirut. The next day I had dinner with a Lebanese friend of mine who worked on Monte Carlo radio, and his wife was a linguist, Algerian, taught at Jussieu, which is one of the University of Paris. By accident, she mentioned that she was reading something by Chomsky, and I said, well, yesterday we were having dinner together. Now, he's a demigod then, at a time when Chomsky, forget PBS, forget media, nobody would touch him. The New York Review of Books told him and Edward Said, the editor Silver, I will not publish you as long as my brother lives in Jerusalem. And he happened to live in the house next to Edward Said's house in West Jerusalem, right? So that type of attempt to black out, but Chomsky is, in many ways, the Kant of his generation, the Immanuel Kant of his generation. He's a towering figure, not just writes about politics. He changed the paradigms of linguistics and all that. Now, you chose to kind of start with Chomsky. He's your first major figure that you interview, and you continually go back to him, including the new book. Just elaborate a little bit and tell us something about Noam the person.
Noam the person, that's an easy one.
Yeah.
He's very sweet and very humble and walks the walk and that he talks the talk. You never feel in any way humiliated. There are no power plays. He's very egalitarian in that way. And I wrote him a letter. That's how we got connected. People here old enough to remember letters, envelopes,
Right.
stamps. So it was an old form of
Snail mail,
communication.
guys.
Old form of communication. And to my surprise, I wrote him a fan letter. I had just read The Washington Connection and Third World Fascism, which is a tour de force. It's a 2-volume set that he did with his colleague Edward Herman. And I wrote him a simple fan letter. You know, read your book, fab, really loved it, thanks so much. To my surprise, he wrote back. You know, usually when you write to stars or celebrities, you either hear nothing back, no response, or there's a form letter. At best, it will say, thank you for your interest, you know, have a nice day, sincerely yours, and that's it. So he wrote back. That started a correspondence. And at this time, I was kind of learning my trade at KGNU, the community radio station in Boulder. And I pitched to him the idea of doing an interview. And so this is now 1984, and our first interview was in politics and language. I thought, well, here's an opportunity to talk about how the words are used, how vocabulary is mobilized to manufacture consent, to manufacture fear, to highlight different political issues. And so that was the beginning of our connection. I didn't meet him until actually 2 years later when he came to Boulder, and then we did a series of interviews, and that turned into be the first broadcast of alternative radio. It's hard to describe someone of such enormous intellectual power, but what I find unique about Noam, and he asked you to call him Noam, you know, none of this Professor Chomsky stuff or that kind of thing, is his ability to take disparate material and he has this syncretic power to bring it all together. So to reduce a lot of information into a kernel of data that is very clear and very precise. I don't know anyone quite who has that particular gift. And he's been putting his work out there. He's turning 90, by the way, on December 7th. Alex Coburn, who's a great independent journalist, used to make the joke, the two greatest disasters that ever befell the American empire was the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 and Noam Chomsky's birth in 1928, because he was born on December 7th. He is still, and now he's at Tucson, he's still producing, still out there, fighting for peace and justice, very much in terms of Senator Daniel Webster, a 19th century politician from Massachusetts. He said, the great work of humankind on earth is the fight for justice, is the struggle for freedom. And he's always put himself on the line. If you needed a signature for a petition, if you needed, a $50 donation, if you needed him to speak, you could call on Chomsky, who is always there for movements, for people that are out there struggling, as using his privilege, as he described in his classic 1967 essay, The Responsibility of Intellectuals. What is that responsibility? First of all, he saw intellectuals as a special privileged class that because of their position, they had enormous opportunities, particularly a task that should involve speaking truth to power and exposing the lies of governments, in the plural, the lies of governments, not just this government, but any government. And you must know that he has been a staunch critic of the Israeli regime almost from its inception. Very consistent. That's another, I think, tremendous quality of his, is his consistency in a very low-mannered, low-keyed voice. If you hear any of his talks, he's not a a great orator, let's say. He's not very expressive. There are not a lot of peaks and valleys, which is something as a radio person, am looking for in a speaker. But the consistency of his thought and the incredible irony and sarcasm that kind of is also interspersed between this enormous assemblage of data that he brings together in a coherent way. I'm still very impressed. We're really lucky to have someone of this caliber at this particular time. So, but then there are other voices out there that are speaking out against the looming fascism. I'm going to use that word. We are. There's more than a whiff of fascism now in this country. It's a pretty strong smell, and we ignore it at our peril. I just witnessed these rallies that have been held most recently in Montana and in Ohio and Iowa. The one, I don't know if you saw the one, the reaction of the audience is what's most telling. Forget about the great leader, the great prevaricator, as I call him, the serial liar. I'm talking about the people in the audience who are cheering on the humiliation of a woman who was the victim of sexual violence and harassment. Cheering on the slam dunking, body slamming of a journalist and calling the media the enemy of the people, which is right out of Joseph Goebbels and Joseph Stalin's, playbook, demonizing journalists. And the audience, they're like this. It's not just men, by the way. There are women up there with signs, "Making America Great." He's keeping promises. And they're chortling. They're like kidding each other. Wow, do you see what he just said, about Dr. Ford, for example? It's very telling and extremely dangerous. So I think, at this moment, I'm not pulling any punches. I'm not hedging my bets here and saying, well, it could be this, it could be that, and, the jury's still out. The jury's not out. When you have open fascistic exhortations coming from the White House, you have to pay attention. And do elections matter? You bet they do. The right wing understands this very well. Just do elections matter? I point to Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, for example. Elections do matter. And it's, I think, important for all of us to get engaged and take this with the seriousness that it deserves. I just did an interview in New York with a Hunter College professor named Benjamin Hett, H-E-T-T. He's written a book called The Death of Democracy, where he talks about what happened to the Weimar Republic, which is, we're not talking about a backward regime, in somewhere in a remote part of the world. This is Germany at the height of its cultural, scientific power, literature, dance, theater, Fritz Lang, Bertolt Brecht, all of these things were going in the science. Germany was first in the world in science and technology in the 1920s. And yet, what happened? What followed? How did that happen? We like to, well, it can't happen here. We're a liberal democracy. We have checks and balances. Well, you've seen how the checks and balances have been working out. Not too many checks and not much balancing. And so, Sinclair Lewis wrote a book called It Can't Happen Here. It's about a charlatan who becomes president of the United States. It was written in 1935, by the way. I commend it to your attention. And he came into power crusading against promiscuity, liberalism, and the press. These were the main issues that brought this president who then became the dictator of the United States. There's all kinds of literature around this. So knowledge of this goes back to the importance of knowing about history, what has happened in understanding the present. It was Orwell in 1984 who said, those who control the past control the future, those who control the future control the present. It's very important that we know what has happened to prevent what is looming from actually occurring. It's a very serious situation, and I hope I do scare some of you tonight into doing something constructive. Not going home and saying, oh man, that guy was so boring and he really bummed me out and I thought things were bad, but he told me it was even worse than I thought. That's not the response. Your cynicism is justified, as Chomsky says. Cynicism is justified. If you look at the situation in the country today, the concentration of power, the massive ripping off of the wealth, and it's driven into the 1% and the 1/10 of 1%. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who was appointed by Woodrow Wilson, he said you can have two things. You can have great concentrations of wealth, or you can have democracy, but you can't have both. And we are rapidly becoming a plutocracy where Koch money and Sheldon Adelson money and Phil Singer money becomes the dominant player. And they're giving money to organizations, I dare say, universities and colleges. Why? Because they love knowledge? Because they love education? Because they want to influence those institutions. That's why they're giving money. That's why they're paying off these people in Congress, our so-called representatives, many of them, 535 of them in total, who are taking lots of corporate money to do their bidding. So cynicism is justified, but that should not be a gateway to apathy. It should be a gateway to activism, to being engaged, finding kindred spirits. Now, I don't know what's going on in this community. I haven't been here long enough. Maybe there are some organizations we can hear about where you can join, where you can participate, because it's important to overcome isolation and feeling atomized, because that's how power controls people. Not just through fear, but through atomization. For this, I commend to you Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he warned the country, this is in 1985, warned the country about when our political discourse becomes a form of baby talk, when our society becomes infantilized, then a civilization, a society is in great danger. Now, this is 20, 30 years before the Kardashians, okay? This is 20, 30 years before, Housewives of Malibu and Housewives of Beverly Hills and Atlanta and Miami Beach and all the other weapons of mass distraction. That's what the media are, a weapon of WMD, weapon of mass distraction. We should have some kind of UN Security Council resolutions, to prevent these kind of weapons, because you see how the great leader in Washington is weaponizing language. Lock her up, build the wall, drain the swamp. Worst deal ever. Any deal like the Paris Accord on the climate, worst deal ever. Iran deal, worst deal ever. And then USA, enemy of the press, booing and hissing, targeting, demonizing journalists. And, I have to defend this profession. I'm not thrilled with a lot of their work, but this is exactly what Goebbels and Hitler did. The big lie technique. If you take anything away from tonight, understand that is what's going on. These are not small things he's lying about. He's lying about Obama being not born in the United States, being a foreigner, lying about voter fraud, which is, beyond any kind of description, totally fabrication, a total invention. One study has 4 examples of voter fraud. I think the Washington Post did that. Another one, more exhaustive, from 2000 to 2014, 31 examples of voter fraud. It's a non-issue, but it plays to this base that he's whipping up into a frenzy of xenophobia and nationalism. And now he's come out of the closet and bragging, I am a nationalist. Well, we've seen what nationalism has done in fascist Italy, in fascist Spain, in fascist Germany, in fascist Portugal, in fascist Chile, and in other states, and a massive increase in autocratic regimes around the country, not just in Eastern Europe, but in Asia under Modi, in the Philippines under Duterte, Orban in Hungary, Kaczynski in Poland, and on and on. The Alternative for Deutschland is now the 3rd largest party in the Bundestag in Germany. They have over 90 seats. In state after state, country after country, there's been a backlash against neoliberalism, and these fascists have come to the fore saying, I have the answer. You know, they have the answer. It's scapegoating. It's the foreigners. It's the, you know, it's the immigrants. It's the, you know, the backroom deals. It's the bankers. All of this kind of, you know, excusing what's going on. So, in a nutshell, it's, you know, Chomsky has been consistently pointing out these disparities of power and how concentrations of wealth lead to not just great economic inequality, but political inequality. Because those that got, they want to keep. And they want to keep it by, you know, greasing the skids for the politicians, you know, who they have access to because of the amount of money that they control. Woo!
Let me bring up Arundhati Roy. Now, Arundhati Roy, you've interviewed her well. How many of you know who Arundhati Roy is? That's not bad, right? Her first novel, she's only had 2 novels, and in between she's had many a feisty set of essays, right? Like War Talk. And in this particular book, she has a wonderful chapter, The Loneliness of Noam Chomsky, you know, of his confrontation with the empire. Her newest novel is The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. I'm in the process of reading it now. Now, Arundhati Roy, to go back to the notion of the ideas of neoliberalism and fascism, you know, she's been a thorn in the side of India's political class and India's elites and India's castes system that prevails despite formally not being there, right? So bring her voice in. You know, what are the things that you were interested with her in covering this? I mean, War Talk is fascinating. There's several of these works out there, and this is an author I think you should be familiar with, Arundhati Roy. Brilliant, articulate, and she is a voice that fights in India. Fascism in India as there are voices in Europe and in the US. Tell us a little bit about your encounters with Arundhati Roy.
I met her at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in 2001. The Progressive magazine sent me there to do an interview with her. I was interested in her work, and she was giving the Iqbal Ahmed lecture at Hampshire College. And it was very, after giving a brilliant talk, she's a wonderful orator, speaker, public speaker. I noticed the audience was full of South Asian women, and they all lined up after the presentation was over, you know, to get her autograph, sign her book. And there was this, I've seen that also with Angela Davis. African-American women in particular, after a talk would go and just bask in her aura, as it were. But Angela, like Arundhati, they don't play the power game. You know, I'm this and, you know, you're nothing. Very much with the people. Roy has been fighting Hindutva, which is this Hindu nationalism that has actually deep roots in the 1920s. That's when it really starts with the formation of a fascist party in India, modeled after Mussolini and Hitler, inspired by what was going on in Europe at the time. Roy comes from a Christian family in Kerala, in the southwestern corner of India, a state that long has voted communist in election after election. But there were peculiar kinds of communists. There were Mercedes-Benz communists, okay? There were Cafe au lait communists. So they talked the talk about, you know, of Marx, but in practice, and this is what came out in her classic novel that brought her such attention, The God of Small Things, they practiced the same caste-riven politics. Decisions were made based on, you know, where you went to school, who your father was, and that kind of thing. So it was a huge expose, and the Hindu nationalists despise Roy. I mean, there's a real loathing for her. They would like nothing more for her to disappear, and I worry about her safety, quite frankly. She lives in an unguarded house in New Delhi. It has been attacked. It has been the subject of demonstrations right out in front. And she told me once, it's always dangerous to be a tall poppy in a field. If you stick out, then you can, you're attracting that kind of energy. So, but I don't think she would have it any other way than to be a tall poppy, to be someone who, fights for integrity and fights for justice. And there is no issue in India more loaded for Hindu nationalists, more pregnant with anxiety than the issue of Kashmir. Kashmir is a legacy of British imperialism, which has a sterling record of messing things up all over the world: Palestine, Cyprus, Central Africa, East Africa, Ireland, wherever the Union Jack was flown, discord followed because of the way the colonial system operated, divide and rule and the like. So this is a legacy of 1947 that was never resolved, something that Iqbal Ahmed talks about in detail, as well as Arundhati. I tell American audiences to understand what Kashmir means to a Hindu nationalist. It's similar to what Israel represents to a Zionist. They will brook no criticism. It just sets off absolute bouts, spurts, spasms of rage and anger if you bring this issue up, because it is the site of enormous human rights violations. It is the site of enormous, not just human rights violations, murder, state-sponsored terrorism. I heard this, I learned a term in Kashmir called custodial deaths. I didn't know what this meant, custodial deaths. It means when you go into a police station or a government prison, you don't come out. Tens of thousands of Kashmiris have been killed. Hundreds of thousands have been tortured in the torture camps all over Kashmir. This is a story that's barely covered internationally and almost not covered at all here in the United States, because India has been very successful at waging a propaganda campaign. If you open your TV or the New York Times full-page ads, visit exotic India, and there's a picture of the Taj Mahal, and there's all this stuff about sitar music and ragas, and everyone's practicing yoga and living in ashrams, and the spiritual people practicing different disciplines and the like, vegetarianism, of course, and so India has won the propaganda war. But people like Roy still hold truth up and shine a light on that darkness that the Indian state has enveloped Kashmir. Now, there are many other struggles going on in India, but those are mostly to change the regime in Delhi. The one that's going on in Kashmir that is unreported is to get out of India. It is a separatist movement. They don't want to be part of Hindutva India. So that independence movement is regarded with great anxiety and fear by New Delhi, and it's because of my reporting on Kashmir. I have to say, because I've never gotten an explanation from the Indian government. No emails have ever been responded to. Letters have not been responded to either. So I'm in this kind of Kafkaesque, dark hole. But it's about Kashmir, and the U.S. has been supporting the Indian regime, selling weapons. I was there the time before. Last time I was there was 2011. Obama was there with 200 executives from the biggest corporations in the United States, particularly military corporations, because India has become the single largest purchaser of military weapons. And so it's an issue that is still burning there, and there will be no peace in South Asia, as there will be no peace in Palestine unless these issues are addressed and there is some kind of just resolution. And so Roy has been in the front line. She could have been a very successful novelist. She turned to politics because of the urgency of the situation that she felt that she had to respond. So she is a kind of lonely voice. She does have some allies there, but India has veered way to the right, way enthralled by Hindu nationalism, and so she recognizes those dangers and speaks out fearlessly. And I think, if there's one person that is in danger, I think it is, Arundhati Roy, and I certainly, worry about her well-being. Long answer to a short question. Sorry.
I have a short question, and then I'm going to hand it off to you, Tom. Now, Iqbal Ahmad and Edward Said were often fond of repeating two particular issues, some of which you alluded to. For example, they often quote Aimé Césaire. How many of you know who Aimé Césaire is? All right, well, we have to. Aimé Césaire is kind of the person from Martinique. He introduces a whole writing on negritude, which is really the early form of black power articulations. And among the things that that both Iqbal Ahmad and Edward quote from him, there is room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. Then a second, they both insist on it, and I say it in my classes, from Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Comment on how these issues kept rising between them and you, and of course the public who has read them. And then we'll move on to Tom to raise a few other questions. And then we will have plenty of time for questions.
Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will was kind of a byline for Iqbal and for Edward as well. What did they mean by this? Why are they quoting Gramsci so favorably? Pessimism of the intellect is to acknowledge what is in front of us, some of which I've described, the situation we are facing right now, not in some abstraction, with this whiff of fascism in the air. That is, we should be ruthless and rigorous in analyzing what's going on. Okay, so we realize, that it's a bad situation. These are its components. These are its historical antecedents. And we have to have optimism of the will. Now, when they say optimism of the will, they don't mean magical thinking, that, we go off into things will work out, it's not as bad as you say it is. Certainly, the powers that be won't allow for it to get any worse. This is all magical thinking, like pigs can fly, or, reindeer speak Urdu, for example. We have, some would say, right? So we have to, be rigorous and ruthless in understanding what's going on in an objective way, and then in a creative way come up with some kind of response, solutions. Because if you don't come up with solutions and alternatives, then people do lapse into despair, which is, of course, immobilizing and paralyzing and plays right into the hands of power. That's where they want you to be. They want you to worry about, should I buy a Honda or a Toyota? Should I watch the Game of Thrones rerun tonight, or should I watch the new episode of Law and Order? Concern yourself with those kinds of distractions, consumerism and the like. So coming up with alternatives is absolutely critical, and that's how movements build, and that's how hope is sustained when you are in community with others, like-minded kindred spirits, let's call them. We draw strength from them. Because if you're just thinking, I'm the only one in the room, or I'm the only one on campus that has these funny ideas, it can be isolating. So breaking through that isolation is not only critical from a political point of view, from an emotional perspective, it's very, very important. Because we need to heal ourselves also in terms of the wounds, that we've absorbed from, a system that takes no prisoners, that maximizes the gains for the masters of mankind, as Adam Smith called the early capitalists, the masters of mankind. I'm going to just go right back into Chomsky, for example, who's actually read Adam Smith, and it's nothing that you think that is taught in the economics departments, maybe at the University of Colorado or at Cal. It's a different Adam Smith that deplored what the empire was doing in India, for example, looting the country, really existing capitalism, as Chomsky calls it.
We have a Adam Smith Institute here that is based on Coke money, and they do wonderful scholarship that ignores all what you said.
Yeah. Well, really existing capitalism, of course, depends on an enormous amount of socialism. That is to say, money to bail out failing corporations, or money to enable corporations to make even more money. The tax code is manipulated to favor the corporations. So really existing capitalism has many other components that are not usually talked about. So there are all these stories of Bill Gates and Paul Allen in a garage in Palo Alto, inventing the internet. They didn't invent the internet. You invented the internet. We paid for the internet through the Pentagon DARPA program, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. That's where the internet developed, and then it was miraculously turned over to private corporations who then bleed us dry with their fees and sign up contracts, etc. That's really existing capitalism. Really existing capitalism, again, what Chomsky points out, the aviation industry, that's all out of Pentagon research. So when you sit on a civilian airliner, all the avionics is all developed at the public trough. We pay for all of that. Pharmaceuticals, the National Institutes of Health, develop vaccines and medicines with public money, as they should, and then all of a sudden, the bounty of that research gets into the hands of Eli Lilly and Pfizer and GlaxoSmithKline and these other gigantic pharmaceutical corporations who charge us an arm and a leg. So capitalism has a big, really existing capitalism has a big whiff of government intervention in it that is not talked about sufficiently. Sorry, to get back to how the importance of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, and to present alternatives is absolutely critical. Otherwise, we're just in an ivory tower. Otherwise, we're just mouthing off. Otherwise, we're just listening to a program on the radio and not connecting it with anything on the ground, whether it's working with immigrants, giving ESL lessons, or working with the underprivileged or the homeless, which you have there's a major issue of that here in Southern California. But I was just walking on Madison Avenue and 78th Street, posh Upper East Side. There were people digging into the garbage cans, pulling out food. There it was. And then I got on, one of the worst subway lines in the country, the number 6 Lexington Avenue local. It's like being in the 19th century, screeching trains, super noisy, filthy, dark, trains running late. This is the beginnings of a banana republic. So the rich are not worried about this. They fly out in their private jets to Aspen, for a weekend on the Cape, and so you have a division into the kind of Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, Hamptons, Malibu crowd, and then the rest of us. And we're supposed to just sit by and watch this happen and think, well, it's, they worked hard for it. They didn't work hard for it. Most of them, are the product of inherited wealth and then benefiting from an economic system which privileged them through these tax cuts and other loopholes and benefits. No, I didn't address the first part. César, yes. Meeting at the Victory. This is a marvelously optimistic and hopeful scenario that César is talking about, that there is room for all of us at the rendezvous of victory. I wonder about that. Particularly given the present context, if indeed there is room for American Taliban, for religious fundamentalists, who are against gays, who are against reproductive rights for women, who believe in imperialism. Is there room at the table for them? I certainly don't want to cut them out, but I'm not going to waste a lot of energy, which is finite, on people who believe that 2 and 2 is 5. After a point, you have to cut your losses. You present your information, You get some backup and other evidence, and here it is. 2 and 2 is unequivocally 4. If you insist on saying it's 5, I'm going to move on, and I won't see you at the rendezvous of victory. Does that make me an elitist? No, I think it makes me someone who is practical, who has control over the lights. On. There we are. So, ideally, yes, we'd love to meet at this table where there's bountiful and nutritious food, no GMOs, no additives, no color dyes, real food for real people. Another very important issue, incidentally, the food. And you wonder how to build coalitions and movements. You find on the issue of food, there's no left-right division. If you ask any staunch person who's right-wing conservative, do you want your children to drink clean water? Do you want them to breathe clean air? Do you want them to eat nutritious food or GMO-laden food that has no nutritional value and is laden with chemicals and the like? The answer is unanimously. Of course I want those things. So there are certain areas where there are, as Gramsci would call them, apertures, openings that we can exploit. Maybe once we talk about that, well, why is the food chain so corrupted now? Why has corporate control of food become such a major issue? That's how you can expand a discourse, expand a discussion. Most people want the environment to be protected. Most people believe in reproductive rights. Most Americans, in poll after poll, they want Social Security protected. They want Medicare expanded. They want Medicaid protected and expanded. They want more benefits for people. Social Security to be expanded as well. You know why the system is in putative trouble? It's not really in trouble. It's because the cap is so low. The cap now is $128,000, okay? So that means that Warren Buffett and me and Tom and Nubar, if we're all paying at the same rate, we're paying the same amount of money as Warren Buffett. That could be easily doubled or tripled, which would cover Social Security expenses well into the 21st century. It's a very simple solution that the politicians are not talking about. So getting back to that rendezvous, I'd love to see everyone there, but realistically, there's going to be some choices made in terms of who will be at that table. But to hold it out as an ideal, certainly.
Yes, I have just one question, which will hopefully tie together a couple of aspects of your career, and then perhaps let the audience take a turn. You opened up, David, with a critique of Reagan-era foreign policy, the interventionism, the installing of friendly regimes in Central America and Angola. I wonder, have we seen almost a mirror image of Reagan's foreign policy vision with Trump? And what I mean by that, insofar as he can be said to have a coherent foreign policy, his instincts seem to be opposite of that of Reagan. We're not engaging in military adventures except 2 ego-based strikes on Syria. We're not, so far as we know, funding these illegitimate overthrows. Is there a clear line that runs between Reagan and Trump here in foreign policy?
Well, imperialism, which is part and parcel of an extension of U.S. foreign policy, has been very constant for decades, if not centuries. First, the internal imperialism here, the destruction of the indigenous population, the introduction of slavery to these shores, and then expanding into Latin America, Central America, and then into Latin America, our little garden over here that never bothered anyone, as Henry Stimson said. He was FDR's Secretary of War. The U.S. foreign policy under Reagan was somewhat different in that it was based on a system of alliances. So the current regime seems to have disdain for some of these military alliances that were set up right after World War II. NATO was formed in 1945. 49. So that seems to be a bit of a departure, but I would take issue with your comment about a seeming reduction in military violence. My reading is quite the opposite. There is a huge expansion of the U.S. military intervention in North and West Africa that, again, not being reported on. There are thousands of U.S. troops. Did you know that operating in Niger and Mali and other countries in West Africa, East Africa? Of course, you know Somalia and the bombings in Yemen, the destruction of Libya. I mean, that happened under the previous regime in Washington. But the violence, the threat of violence, is there all the time. Iran is certainly a target again, particularly since the deal was canceled by the great prevaricator. And so the possibility of war, I think, is increasing, because if the great leader feels endangered, then how do you whip up the public? How do you mobilize I was going to say the peasantry, the people, through military action? Get behind a flag. That's what, you know, Huey Long said, the Kingfisher, the former governor from Louisiana he was assassinated in 1935. If you want to read a really good book about fascism, read All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren. It's a novel about Huey Long and the rise of fascism. It was made into a black and white movie with Broderick Crawford in the late 40s, and recently Sean Penn did a revival of it in color. So check it out. It's really interesting. Again, like Arundhati Roy says, fiction is sometimes the best truth there is. You can tell things in fiction that, you know, may not be believed in a book of nonfiction. I want to go back just a little bit again to talk about despair and depression. And I'm not telling you that things are, you know, peachy keen and rosy and all of that, but Eduardo Galeano was a great journalist and historian. His book, Open Veins of Latin America, is the precursor, by the way, to Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. It's a must-read, a great novelist. He once saw a graffiti in Latin America at the height of the US-backed dictatorships in Uruguay, in Chile, in Brazil, in Argentina. I mean, the whole continent had gone to the military right in a series of coups d'etats. And the graffiti said, "Let's save depression for better times." So if we can turn this Titanic, we are on the Titanic. But the difference is we can actually see the iceberg in front of us. That's global warming. Or as Ralph Nader chided me recently, said, don't call it global warming, call it global climate disruption. That's what you should be calling it, because the climate is being disrupted. We can see right in front of us what's happening. So are we going to be able to turn this ship around? When that happens, maybe we can sit back and have a Perrier or some other non-alcoholic drink and congratulate ourselves.
Or a single malt scotch.
Or a single malt scotch. And congratulate ourselves that we were able to protect our mother. Our mother is under assault. That's what, you know, Mother Nature, if I can feminize nature, and it is in almost every language. Nature, the earth, is feminine in its linguistically, grammatically speaking. Full-scale assault, looting and plundering, all for the wealth of a few corporations. So, I was in Armenia in June of 2017, and I learned there that it is the most densely mined country on the face of the earth. There are 400 major mining operations going on in this tiny little space, by the way. It's probably smaller than the size of smaller than Connecticut. And huge amount of, plunder and looting going on. I'm going to break away now for a little diversion. You'll excuse me. But an amazing thing happened in this little republic, landlocked country in March of April. There was a peaceful, nonviolent revolution overthrowing an entrenched oligarchy that, again, was barely reported here. How many of you had heard about it? Amazing. I mean, this is an educated...
You had to go to Glendale to hear that story.
We covered it for the LA Review of Books. I just point that out.
Armenia, like all the other post-Soviet states, immediately lapsed into an oligarchy, mafia rules. I mean, the commissars just changed, one set of clothes for a new set of clothes. And they went on with their looting and plundering. And so I was there in June of 17. I met with a lot of activists that were very angry. One could say that there was a movement building, right? But I couldn't, it wasn't defined yet. And then a politician, his name is Nikol Pashinyan, decides to have a walk across Armenia. Very much like Gandhi's March to the Sea, the Salt March in around 1930 to protest British rule in India. And as this fairly unknown politician was walking from town to town, he would be picking up more and more people that would join him. This ultimately led into hundreds of thousands of Armenians taking to the streets. This is in a country with a population of 2.9 million. So we're talking hundreds of thousands of people. Fully 30, 40, 50% of the population of the country came out in the streets, shut the country down. The airport was shut down, the railroad system was shut down, the metro in Yerevan didn't operate, the ministries couldn't open because they were completely surrounded by people. The ministers could not get out of their dashas, their palatial homes, because again, they were ringed in by nonviolent, peaceful protesters. And unlike a previous uprising in 2008, when the police opened fire, the sheer number, and there were many casualties, the sheer number of people that turned out prevented the military, the security forces, from taking action. So they just stood there. And ultimately, the regime fell. An amazing story. And now there's this kind of parliamentary democracy. There's a move toward rolling back some of the neoliberalism which enveloped Armenia as well as many other countries in that particular region. But that was a very hopeful sign, I must say, when people ask me, do you see hope? Because that's always the question. There are, as Auden says in his master poem, September 1st, 1939, there are little dots, flashes of light everywhere, where the enlightened meet and carry forward the work of justice. I'm paraphrasing this great, great poem by Auden, September 1st, 1939, which he wrote in a dive on 52nd Street in New York. That's the first line. I'm writing these lines in a dive on 52nd Street. It was the day, by the way, that the German army attacked Poland, launching World War II. So I don't know if that answered some of your questions, but I have a tendency to digress.
Peter. This is Peter McLaren in our School of Education.
Hi.
I loved your conversation. I just wanted to do two things. First of all, affirm what you said about Noam Chomsky. In 2005, 2006, I was teaching at UCLA, and at the same time I was flying and working with Hugo Chavez in Miraflores Palace in Venezuela, in Caracas, and a right-wing group calling itself the Bruin Alumni Association labeled 30 of us at UCLA, put me at the top of the list as the most dangerous professor in UCLA.
But you know you are.
But
Endearingly, that is.
well, I probably could have, but they offered students $100 to secretly audio tape my classes, $50 to present lecture notes. And so this didn't bode well. They also stole the donor lists of the major donors to UCLA, did brochures about the 30 of us, and sent them to the donors saying, your $10 million donation every year to UCLA is going to pay the salary, whatever. But anyway, so when I was under attack, I wrote to Noam Chomsky, and I'd never met Chomsky. And he, to my shock, because being in a school of education, we don't have a lot of, major public intellectuals. We've got John Buccoso, we've got Henry Giroux, and other people. And he wrote a UCLA, and I was just, I'm just, you know, and to this day, I'll send him something on liberation theology I'd written, and he'll write back.
Yeah.
And that's Noam Chomsky. I mean, it's the generosity of spirit that he has. But I was a student of Paulo Freire, and you know, you were mentioning
In Brazil?
Hmm?
In Brazil?
In Brazil.
Mm.
Well, he's a mentor of mine. I didn't officially study under him, but we've done things together. And it was a statue.
Everybody, Paulo Freire, great educator, pedagogy of the oppressed. Luckily, some of our School of Education faculty are Freirean in their approach, so that's what he's referring to.
And we have a statue, the only statue
Yep.
in the continent of Paulo Freire is here at Chapman.
That's right.
And
Really?
and Nita Freire, Paulo's widow, has come, we visit, we've had ceremonies, etc. And I know with President Chavez, for instance, Freire's work was really important. And remember when Hugo Chavez presented Obama with
Hegemony or Survival, the Chomsky book.
and also
At the UN.
At the UN General Assembly, yeah.
Also Galeano's book, right?
Open Veins.
Open Veins of Latin America. But my question would be, and still related to Brazil, Bolsonaro, you know, could win the runoff. And Bannon is coaching Bolsonaro and is a right-wing, you know, fascist who is advocating in Brazil. He's openly advocating torture, the return of the military dictatorship, and he's being coached right now for the runoff by Steve Bannon. And Dilma, who was put in prison, you know, Lula, of course, in prison. Dilma, who was a communist revolutionary who became president of Brazil. Dilma was tortured. And here is Bolsonaro, possibly about to become the next ruler of Brazil, right, advocating the kind of torture that Dilma had to endure. I mean, it's just staggering, and I'm just wondering what you think of that situation, and Steve Bannon being there now, coaching Bolsonaro.
Yeah, it's not a surprise that Bannon is there. Before I answer your question, a lot of people came in late and didn't sign up, you among them. So those of you who didn't sign this sheet, please do. That way I can keep you informed of alternative radio.
Before you respond, Bolsonaro, by all accounts, is going to win.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
He looks like, in fact, I just met some Brazilian people in New York, and they're absolutely convinced he's going to win.
Stabbed
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
during his campaigning, and it's really made him like a superhero now.
Yeah.
You know, like a martyr who was attacked, stabbed, and survived. So
I think
God-
what's scary is not just his fascism.
Yeah.
He's unleashed an outright racist discourse. Remember, Brazil is a very
Multiracial.
multinational, multiracial, right? So the Afro-Brazilian dimension is being dehumanized as we speak in the Brazilian context. That's yeah. Oh yeah, of course.
If you want to read a very comprehensive article about this in the Los Angeles Review of Books, we're running it on the 28th, which is the day of the election, the morning of the election. Of everything I've ever edited for this publication, this is probably one of the most chilling articles that I've yet sent through for publication. So I say this in praise of the article, but also in affirmation for what my colleagues have said. It is not a pretty picture at all.
2 weeks ago, Chomsky, at the age of almost 90, flew to Brazil and met with Lula in prison in an act of solidarity. Again, showing you, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. What can I say about Bannon? I mean, there's a precious moment in Michael Moore's new documentary, Fahrenheit 11/9. Have some of you seen that? Bannon he's interviewing Bannon, and he's saying, what's the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats? He says, Republicans, we go for the head wound. We go for massive damage being done. And the Democrats kind of footsie around, and they don't really do anything significant. And they're playing hardball. They're out to win, and they're, ruthless in their ferocity and just staying on message and playing into rampant homophobia, a revival of patriarchy, all of these things. Now, this is an example of the morbid symptoms that Gramsci is talking about that arise when civilizations are in decline. I'm going to be hopeful and say this is the last gasp of patriarchy. This is the last gasp of misogyny, the last gasp of reactionary politics. I'm hoping this is the case. But if we are idle bystanders, if we're fence sitters, if we're straddling, well, I might get involved, might not, it's not going to happen.
Any other questions?
Catholicism, a lot of these are right-wing Catholics, and yet we've got Papa Francisco, maybe it's some.
Right. There we go again. Lights out.
Yes, sir.
I have to thank you for giving me a new term from this experience. And the term is flashes of darkness.
That's good.
Well, I remember a day back in the 60s when we actually, while disagreeing, we talked. And somehow this art of dialogue and working things out, mutually striving for consensus, has somehow been dissipated, is lost. So now, as soon as people find out they think differently, they go ballistic. They get somehow, the shields go up, and now they don't hear anything. We don't have a dialogue anymore. It's just shouting.
Well, that has a lot to do with, the political system where, one of the two major parties has fallen off the cliff and the other one has, kind of landed right near the edge of the cliff in terms of extreme politics. And that's, you have this siloization of information. So people get some people get a diet from Alex Jones, InfoWars, and Red State, and Breitbart News, and Fox, and that's their only source of information. And then they hear the great leader, pontificating about the enemy of the press and fake news and all the rest, all the other demagogic, words that flow effortlessly from his ineffable mouth. This is the 75th anniversary of the White Rose movement. We think we have problems in this country organizing. Imagine organizing in Nazi Germany. Here were a couple of young kids at the University of Munich, brother and sister, Hans and Sophie Scholl, S-C-H-O-L-L. Maybe you've heard about them. We have a brother here from Germany. They printed leaflets and pamphlets and stuck them under doors, gave them to people, put graffiti on the walls. Their most famous graffiti is, every word that comes out of Hitler's mouth is a lie. So you can just put someone else that is in the news in that place and find out, how close you are to replicating that. So what happened to them? They were captured by the Gestapo and beheaded. They went to the guillotine. And the small group around them. Think about, the risks that people have taken historically. Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, and many, many others who have fought for justice. So we are, this goes back to intellectuals also, but as a general population, let me just generalize about this group. No one is worried about where you're going to sleep tonight, I hope not, or where your next meal is coming from, or how I'm going to pay the rent, or any of these things. So in a sense, we are fairly privileged. That gives us the space to be active, to engage in movement building or movement participation. We have that privilege. People who are working 2-3 jobs and can't pay the rent, can't get meals on their tables for the kids, they don't have that space. So think about our privilege, and also, we're not living yet in a Nazi-type state. We can have meetings like this. I can, produce radio programs and broadcast them, and we haven't gone to that level yet. But, we have to be on guard. We have to be alert to what is happening and to use our privilege when we can, to deploy it in a positive way to build movements of resistance. And I think, again, this is very salutary from an emotional, a physical health point of view. Because if you're just critical and carping and negative, you know, that builds up a lot of toxins in your system. But by engaging in something, you know, like, so I didn't like the media. Great, deep analysis. It stunk. I decided to do something about it. Now, that worked for me. But to find something that you can do that you feel authentic in, you know, with hashtag #MeToo, which I think is one of the most important movements out there right now. Idle No More in Canada is a great movement that we should be paying attention to. What happened at Standing Rock, even though it ended in defeat, it was quite remarkable that 200 Indian nations, I don't use the term tribe, which is very colonial, 200 Indian nations that had never before come together, unified there and were resisting the power of the petrochemical lobby and the political forces. So even though that was a kind of a defeat, it was also a victory in showing that people united can have an impact, can change the direction of history and the discourse. And so finding something that works in terms of resistance is, I think, crucial to our mental and spiritual, if I can use that term, health. And, you know, it's Martin Luther King Jr. used to say, it's better standing on your feet fighting the power than on your knees begging for a few crumbs. You know, there is no dignity in that. There's no self-respect in that. And ultimately, you know, we have to look in the mirror. We have to face our children and grandchildren and say, well, where were you when the planet was dying? Oh, I was, you know, watching the Kardashians, and, you know, I loved Oprah, and, you know, I was watching, the this or that, season 2, The White House, episode 6. That's what we're kind of in now, you know, a reality.
Isn't it embarrassing for us, you and me, that a fellow Armenian, a Kardashian, I mean, Jesus. Right?
No group is free from mediocrity.
Exactly.
Well,
Carmichael.
On this thing of dialogue, I think dialogue is really important. I think the death of dialogue, that civility dies with the death of dialogue. However, I cannot dialogue with you about alternative facts. Facts are not the issue in dialogue, it's our interpretation of them. And so if my interlocutor wants to make facts the issue, it's a shifting ground, and to pretend that I'm going to engage in dialogue will be to give dignity to something that should not be dignified.
yeah,
What
we're
do
in.
you have to say about that?
Well, Professor Carmichael, now that you've put me on the spot, I'll have to come up with a very sharp answer in response. You can't, at a point, this was made earlier actually, at some point you have to, you know, cut your losses. You know, you do make an attempt to reason with someone, but if they're convinced that 2 and 2 is 5, no amount of evidence that you produce contrary to that is going to persuade them. So you have to move on. You just can't stay in that same rut and just go over and over again, beating, you know, this person over the head. It gets really boring for that person. It gets boring for you. So you make an editorial decision. I do that all the time, you know, in terms of what material am I going to select for the program. You know, is the speaker, you know, cogent? Is it, does it have enough electric audio quality to it, etc. So we're making editorial decisions. I don't mean that in an elitist way. Time is finite, and you have to see where there are openings. And I think, you know, for example, I mentioned the environment and food safety, nutrition. Those are possibilities where you can engage people. Would most people in California agree that housing prices are outrageous? You know, I don't think that's a minority view. So then you could start talking about that. But of course, the question is, what kind of economic system produces that outcome? That's where you've got to jump to, not just to belabor the point that, you know, prices are outrageous, people can't afford to buy homes or you know, even pay rents, or they have to double up, triple up, quadruple up, you know, and sleep in bunk beds and the like. So, you know, you're making those kind of choices all the time. But we're in an age now where a certain group is anti-science as well, anti-facts. They believe climate change is a hoax. You know, these are flat Earth believers probably as well. So how do you reason with people that have unreasonable and irrational thoughts? I mean, I'm putting that out there. I think the answer is you can't. And so you have to move on at some point. And this is most felt in families and among friends. You know, I hear stories of, I can't talk to my brother. I haven't spoken to my niece in 10 years because she's this and that.
I've seen 3 hands right now, so.
Can I say one quick thing?
Sure. After all, this is Professor Peters, we are so honored.
What's all the shade about? Listen here, old Nubar. The reason I'm returning to this thing about dialogue because I think it's really important, and there is a way in which we have been stuck in communicative silence everywhere on all parts of the spectrum. I think there are certain rules to dialogue. One is reliable evidence, coherent reasoning, and sound judgment. Those are rules. And if somebody decides they're not going to play by those rules, I can't engage in dialogue with them. And often progressives are criticized for their refusal to engage in dialogue with people who don't want to play with those rules. And I think we have to, as you say, do some editorial thing and move on. I agree with you.
Yes, go ahead, young man, and then we'll go to you, and then the gentleman in the back.
I think an adjacent topic to that would be, we've also actually discussed it in our political science classes, is the tolerance of intolerance in a tolerant community. And it's a kind of somewhat well-known kind of hypocriticalness, but what do you think is the line? Where is the line to not tolerate intolerance? And more importantly, have we crossed it? Have we crossed it in this last week with this memo that was released by the Trump administration about trans redefinition of gender? And what do we do about that? Where do we put the line of stopping intolerance?
That's a really good question. I mean, there are all kinds of lines that are being violated right now. You see a reassertion of patriarchy and misogyny and homophobia coming, forward in a very concentrated and directed type of way. And I think a lot of this is driven by what I call the American Taliban. We have Taliban in this country. Religious fanatics. Can I say that word? Religious fanatics. People who believe in the rapture, that they're going to go up from Jerusalem, and the Jews that don't convert will all be burned in hell, and everyone else will burn in hell if they don't have the right, God on their side, or they're not on the right side of God. So I think the gender issues.
You've just defined my mother.
Aman.
Aman, evangelical Christian.
Well, you can testify then to how difficult it is to talk, particularly to a family member, at some point when the vocabulary is so radically different, and the understanding of words, do not compute with your understanding of words. So I think part of this, I'm hoping, gasp of patriarchy and the ancien regime, the old ways of thinking, that's part of the reason there's such a backlash right now, because of the gains made in the last several decades in the areas of sexuality and recognizing gender diversity. This has been very threatening to the super right wing that is, inflamed by religious rhetoric, that, this is against God's will and, that kind of thing.
Look, Carmichael raised a series of criteria by which discourse can take place, including discourse of difference. Right? In some ways, we are privileged. We can do that in the university, right? And we do that, and that's a privilege that we have. You step outside of campus 2 blocks, and those rules are not as operative, right? So I think those rules are the things that drive us. You know, Sandra, Crystal, Peter, Pete, Carmichael, those of us who teach here at Chapman, and Tom and I, those are the rules that drive us to engage in a conversation. And we don't have to agree with the student or disagree with the student. Right? Sir, your question.
Yeah, so I wanted to say something to this question of limit of ballot. Just a little story which happened 2 weeks ago in England. So maybe it wouldn't work in this country, but it was exactly about like alternative facts, about climate change denial. So again, there was this kind of group of people, experts invited by the BBC on the topic. And there was also the climate change denier, which always has to be on these forums. And suddenly, for the first time, the other guests pulled out. They said, we won't share a panel with the climate change denier. And since then, BBC officially said that they shouldn't, I mean, it's not part of their politics to have to, how should I say this? I mean, there's always this question about being unbiased, right? Being fair to all things, but they clarified that inviting climate change deniers is not, should not be part of BBC politics, of BBC. So this is an example where intellectuals kind of did what you said they should do, and it definitely had an effect.
I disagree. I really think we should be dialoguing with each other, even with deniers or the people who accuse us by it. We do this with our children when they tell us things that are obviously not true. For one thing, I think it sharpens our own logic and enables us to better communicate to the independent minds that are going to be voting or making decisions. I'm not afraid of someone I don't believe thinks differently, even if I say, well, he's totally wrong. Because I find that actually a form of intellectual cowardice. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of the person who says 2 and 2 is 5. But I think that there is something really wrong with the notion that balance means there are 2 sides to everything.
I would agree with
And,
that.
and so therefore to have the people who 0.something% that deny the scientific evidence on an equal footing
That's the problem.
and pretend that this is fair and balanced, it is not. And so if I want, for example, if I want to go to the internet to get information on something, and I have the New York Times and I have the National Enquirer, they are not on equal footing. They're not. And so the deniers are not, and to pretend that it's balanced, that they are equal, creates a problem of credibility.
But that makes the assumption that the rest of the world can't see this for themselves. That some BBC person says this is a balanced point of view. So I must agree with that. I think that that's just simply not true.
You mentioned,
Well,
someone
we had, get the question, I'll get you, Peter. There, and then we'll ask you. Go ahead.
yeah, no, earlier you had mentioned the point that elections are important, and, after Charlottesville, you had the African-American farmer Chris Newman, who made the point that Richard Spencer isn't the problem for him because he can see Spencer coming. It's, women in SUVs with on the first stickers were calling the police on him for being blackball farming. What do you do with a problem like the Democrats?
Before you answer, on Charlottesville, we have a program coming up that Pete Simi from Sociology will be presiding over. You just tell us the date and the time.
Monday, October 29th at 7 p.m. in Memorial Hall. It's the PBS Frontline Special in Charlottesville the year after.
And then there will be a bunch of faculty, including, of course, Pete, on that program. Okay, go ahead.
It's just because, because I'm from Canada, so I've dealt with the Liberal Party. And my parents were in India, so I've dealt with Congress. But the Democrats are just madmen, both in their incompetence and their just complete lack of integrity. And so I'm just wondering, and they formed this so-called resistance. And how do you dialogue even with them? This is my question.
Sorry, I had to chuckle. As a mainstream Democrat, I sort of think the same thing about progressives, extreme progressives.
Okay.
So, you know, be that as it may, we're a big unhappy family together.
I think the November 6th election is crucial. And so I've been angering a lot of progressive friends as I travel around the country saying, you know, close your eyes, you know, hold your nose, and vote for every Democrat in sight. Because of the particular nature of this, you know, the crisis we're facing. You know, if there isn't at least some semblance of an institutional check against someone who has obvious autocratic and bellicose ideas, we're going to be in very, very deep trouble. Now, I'm no fan of the Democratic Party. A lot of Democrats who voted for Obama in great numbers in 2008 then went home and, you know, just congratulated themselves. You know, we got our first African-American president. It's the dawn of a new era. He speaks wonderful English, complete sentences. He knows how to use adverbs and prepositions. Wow, you know, we got it made. That was a huge mistake. We should have kept pressure on Obama in 08 instead of walking away and going to, you know, have a six-pack or something and watch a game. So that was, you know, tactically a huge error. And of course, the right wing rushed into this void and filled it with the Tea Party, which is an example of how a small group of people who make, you know that famous Margaret Mead quote? I don't think she was thinking about the Tea Party. Never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. It always has and it always will. Well, I don't know, you know, maybe she was seeing in her tea leaves the rise of this small group of people that made an enormous amount of noise, got a tremendous amount of media attention for the amount of noise that they made, but represented a tiny sliver of the population. You know, Ralph Nader says, you know, give me 1 million people and I'll change the country. I'll occupy Congress. You know, I'll do what the Armenians did. You know, I won't allow government offices to open, you know, just by being, you know, blocking them with human bodies, sit-ins and the like. The Democrats abandoned their roots. Never a perfect party. It was the party of the New Deal and the working class in this country, such as it was. And, you know, those gains that were made in the 1930s and 1940s were always fought tooth and nail by establishment Republicans. They wanted to, you know, roll back all of these programs that the New Deal introduced, including Social Security, by the way, unemployment insurance, all of these, you know, protections for workers and the like. That was a huge mistake on the part of the Democrats, abandoning who they were and embracing neoliberalism. And so, you know, you got that Malibu crowd. They went from, you know, working class factories in Indiana and Michigan, and they went to the high rollers who in one check could write them, you know, more money than they could get from all of those workers in the Rust Belt, now the Rust Belt in Ohio, which explains a lot of what happened in 2016. Tom Frank has had his finger on the pulse of this for a very long time. So has Chris Hedges, by the way, both of whom I've featured multiple times on alternative radio. So the Democrats, you know, never an ideal party, have really sold out. You know, their core constituency was the working class, and now they're competing for the same big bucks from the corporations, from, you know, the rich liberals.
But David, may I push back on that a little bit, and also against the gentleman in the, may I know your name? Kasha, thank you. I don't disagree with a lot of that critique, but isn't this pervasive cynicism part of what created this insane idea that both parties are the same? The you know, diehardism of Bernie Sanders supporters, the ridiculous candidacy of Jill Stein that allowed Trump to capture those 15,000 popular votes in Wisconsin that gave us Kavanaugh, gave us Neil Gorsuch, gave us this nightmare. Yeah. I mean, aren't you? And yeah, well, let's not even talk about 2000. So I want to respectfully ask, is some of this, you know, harsh critique of the Democratic Party responsible for where we are now?
Yes, I think it is. You know, certainly, you know, the waffling, and the abandoning of, real, genuine liberal progressive programs and embracing neoliberalism, embracing the deregulation, rollbacks of all kinds of, benefits, that has contributed to the,
But the progressive criticism, the cynicism within the movement where we should be together, or instead, I'm just going to express some frustrations, is again, I've identified myself as a mainstream Democrat, getting into so many circular conversations with left progressives that seem to derail what we're trying to do.
But I think the synthesis here is, David is giving a harsh critique, so is this gentleman in the back. But notice what he started with, the importance of voting any Democrat that you can vote for in the upcoming election, right? So that's a common ground. Going back to the notion
Only that
of
we're
how
in 2016.
Yeah. Well, now, unfortunately, we're not. We're 2018, and we have to deal with that. We can talk about those differences and, the new Democratic Party with the Clintons and all that. There are some major changes that have occurred. But at least let's agree, our common ground is that we need more democratic politics, that we need more Democrats elected to prevent the next schmucks who enter our Supreme Court and a few other things. That's a common ground that we have. And let's, and I would love to actually organize an event where we talk about politics, and I'll invite some people in my department with you and all that, and let's talk about the Democratic Party and is it the big umbrella it ought to be? What is it exclude? I think that's a worthy conversation, a quality conversation that we must have at length, but probably not tonight. I want to give this young lady the floor, and then I will take that as kind of our last question, because it is already 9, and I promised we'd finish by 9, and then you will have a chance to buy some books and CDs. Yes.
So I kind of wanted to...
Sorry? Oh, I didn't see you. Okay, and we'll include Alexis after you. Okay.
Kind of wanted to circle back to...
Say something, Alexis.
What you were saying about just cutting your losses and just knowing when to not have those conversations or not try to get your point across. And I agree, and I've sort of taught myself to do that on a one-to-one basis with people in my surroundings. But how does that work then with the big guys? And this is something I asked Dolores Huerta last night. Like, how do you go up against the big guys when homelessness, poverty, sexism, misogyny, all of these issues that we have and that we can do short-term change for, all of those things are rooted in a bigger systemic oppression. So how do we, what is the answer there? And I know it's a super loaded question, but if you cut the loss
Short
with the
answer.
immediate people, how, you know what I mean? How do you go up against the bigger guys? How do you go up against the systemic issues and not just do short-term help or changes?
Yeah, I think the key is to move from I to we. It's to move from the subjective person to the group, because it's through movements that we can exert power. You can make a lot of noise, you can write an eloquent letter, you can give a talk somewhere, but you're one person. It's when we, there's a great poem by Marge Piercy from The Moon is Always Female called The Low Road, where she talks about that. As one person, you can't do very much. But two people, they can give she writes this, they can give each other massages, they can cook for each other. 6 people is a crowd, they can bake a pie and don't share, have enough for everybody. And you build 10,000 as a movement. She goes, it's a wonderful poem. It's called The Low Road by Marge Piercy, one of our best writers whose poems appear in the Monthly Review out of New York, which is a terrific magazine that I get a lot of ideas from about doing programs. Bill McKibben of 350.org, a prominent environmentalist, right? He says at every talk he gets the exact same question: what can I do? And his response is, you've got to get away from the I and find a larger group to act within and to move forward, because that solidarity gives you strength, it gives you solidity. you know, and that's what's so crucial in fighting back in resistance. One person, you can do a few things, but you can't do much. It's when you find an organization or create one with your allies, with your friends, with your kindred spirits, that you can move forward. That's how social change has happened. It hasn't been one-offs. You know, like the revanchist history is that, you know, Rosa Parks was a one-off. She did it by herself. She had a hard day at the office. She didn't have a hard day at the office. She was a movement woman who was trained at the Highlander Center in Nonviolence and Civil Disobedience. She was an ideological woman, therefore posing a huge threat to the power structure. So she had to be dismissed as someone who had tired feet and didn't want to walk to the back of the bus. It was the third or fourth time she tried to do this, by the way. But the fourth time, that was the paulito, as we say in Southwestern Spanish, the kindling that sparked the civil rights movement. Yes, in Tennessee. At the Highlander Center, exactly. So that's how change has happened historically. It's not easy. It's never easy. Struggle is not, it's not baking a cake. You know, it's not, you know, it cannot be, you know, two spoons of sugar and 3 tablespoons of milk. There's no exact formula, but it's exhilarating and it's fun, and you meet great people along the way.
Alexis.
So my question was actually kind of touched upon because we did get into the Democratic Party a little bit, progressives and that rift. However, I do just want to like address the fact that I want to bring in a slightly different perspective onto that and talking about like youth specifically. A lot of youth being kind of compelled to the Democratic Party, not knowing. Sorry, because you mentioned like kind of the difference between the privileged intellectuals and like and how we have the sort of privilege where a lot of people are working a few jobs and don't have it. And I feel from my personal experience when I came into activism, it was through the Democratic Party, and now I'm like much further left. I've been very like jaded and very upset with like all that the Democratic Party has done. But I guess my question is more how do we tangibly like engage with progressives who are like self-proclaimed progressives, but they actually end up just perpetuating and normalizing a lot of the pro-capitalist and pro-war mentality that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have both done. And like, how do we engage with those? Not in a way, not in a matter of hostility or even just like normalization, but just how do we use education in that respect, especially when so many of these concepts that you just mentioned are really institutionalized?
Well, I think, you know, episodic change is very seductive, you know, so we can see, for example, in the environmental movement, right? Corporate capitalism has given us recycling and cars that are, you know, more fuel efficient than gas guzzlers of the type. And we all feel virtuous about, you know, we separate our cardboard and our paper and our glass and our plastic, and we bike whenever we can. But those, you know, those are kind of seductions. They're episodic. They're not structural. They're not fundamentally changing the patterns of misogyny and ageism and sexism and patriarchy. And until and unless we get at the, you know, the institutional racism, these things are going to appear then in different shapes and forms in the future. So finding that voice and finding that community where you feel comfortable, I think it's really important that in activism you feel authentic, you know, and not do something because, you know, oh, you heard somebody say, you know, get involved and, you know, join 350.org or Code Pink or whatever. Do it because you feel, you know, authentic in that action. And, you know, I think that's what elevates us, is when we do collective action. And, you know, you never know what the spark is going to be. No one could have anticipated Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia, you know, who immolated himself because he was being humiliated by the authorities. He was being, you know, asked for bribes and the like, and he couldn't get any justice. That sparked, this was totally unprecedented. Within 3 weeks, a dictatorship collapsed and disappeared. Entrenched dictatorship. By the way, that dictator is sitting in Saudi Arabia in great comfort today. among others that have gotten harbor in our great strategic ally there in Riyadh. So you never know what action is going to tip the scales. It may be totally insignificant, you know, but that's what does it. So we have to always be, you know, like Muhammad Ali said, float like a butterfly, but sting like a bee. You know, finding those places where we can, Gramsci talked about, you know, no wall is monolithic. You can always find some crack in that wall to go in there with energy and ideas and expand the field of discourse and action.
On this note, thank you, David, for joining us. Thank you for joining us. And he will help you. There are the copies of the Chomsky book and
The CDs.
some of his CDs that he will take care of.